Berthe Morisot. Say was one of the most prominent figures of the Impressionist movement during the second half of the 19th century. Raised in a family of the upper bourgeoisie, she taught painting classes from a young age and soon came into contact with Monet, whom she met at the Louvre. At only 23 years old, she exhibited at the Paris Salon. Landscapes and scenes of women with children, reflecting their surroundings, were the main protagonists of her works. Her sister and nephews became her favorite models, in works such as The Cradle and Woman and Child Sitting in the Meadow. In 1874, she joined the Impressionist avant-garde thanks to an invitation from Degas. She interacted with all the important artists of her time and exhibited in London and New York.
Mary Cassatt. Her paintings of women portrayed during their daily lives define the work of Mary Cassatt, an artist born in Pennsylvania in 1844 who spent much of her life in France, where she participated in the Impressionist movement. She studied at the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts and decided to go to Paris, her family's homeland, to participate in the new artistic currents of which she received news. There, Edgar Degas was always her great defender, and the one in charge of integrating her into Impressionism. She was also in charge of bringing this artistic movement to the United States. In 1886 she landed in New England with 300 paintings by painters such as Monet, Degas, and Sisley. Georgia O'Keeffe, considered one of the greatest representatives of American art of the 20th century. Georgia O'Keeffe, born in Wisconsin in 1887, became a pioneer of abstraction in the 1910s. Since she was little she showed interest in painting, but the teaching of figurative art discouraged her. She believed that she would never paint as well as those artists she studied. So he decided to stop imitating what had been done before and follow his own path. His first charcoal works were exhibited in a gallery in New York and the reception was warm. The landscapes and nature and skyscrapers of New York would inspire many of his works. Also the places in New Mexico that she fell in love with and where she went to live after the death of her husband. In 1997, the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum was founded in Santa Fe, and in 2014 one of her works sold at Sotheby's for €35.4 million, breaking the record for a work by a female artist.
Tamara de Lempicka. She was born in Poland and at the age of 20 she went to Paris. The human figure was her great obsession and she was considered one of the greatest representatives of Art Deco. She was known for portraying great ladies and men of high society. Her work was exhibited in important salons and shortly after she won first prize at the International Exhibition in Bordeaux. With the outbreak of World War II she moved to the United States and enjoyed an intense social life. She traveled the world until settling in Texas with her daughter. She finally lived in Mexico, where she died. Alice Neel. Known for her portraits, Alice Neel was born in 1900 in Pennsylvania and died at age 84 in New York. She trained in her hometown and at the age of 25 she married the Cuban painter Carlos Enriquez, with whom she went to live in Havana. The death of her daughter before she was 1 year old marked her work, which represented motherhood in many and diverse ways. Upon returning to the United States, she once again suffered the loss of a daughter, this time because her father took her to Cuba. After settling in New York, she began painting women and children around her and collaborated with a communist publication by creating illustrations. At the end of the 60s, her work began to gain impact and she began to be considered a feminist icon. When she died, she was one of the most recognized and awarded North American artists of her time. Maruja Malo. She became world famous under the name Maruja Malo. At just 20 years old she moved with her family to Madrid, where she trained at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts of San Fernando. There she met Salvador Dali, who was responsible for introducing her to the circles of Surrealism and the generation of 27. Among her first works, Malo illustrated some works by Rafael Alberti. After meeting Ortega y Gasset, she began to collaborate in the Revista de Occidente. In fact, it was at the headquarters of this publication where she held his first individual exhibition. In the 1930s she traveled to Paris, and upon returning to Spain, she worked as a teacher. With the start of the Civil War, she went to Argentina. In the 1960s she returned to Spain and died in 1995. In 1982 she had received the Gold Medal for Merit in Fine Arts. Frida Kahlo. The Mexican is, without a doubt, one of the most famous artists of the 20th century, and there are many exhibitions that have brought her paintings closer to art fans. The life of Frida Kahlo, 1907 to 1954, was marked by the illnesses and suffering that she suffered since she was a child. Poliomyelitis and various operations forced her to endure long convalescence, a loneliness that would be reflected in her works. At just 18 years old, he suffered a traffic accident. Shortly before, he had started doing internships in an engraving workshop, and the time spent resting awakened his interest in painting. His early works captured how he saw his life. At the age of 22, she married fellow painter Diego Rivera, a relationship full of ups and downs that marked her life. He lived with him in the United States, and there his painting evolved. She always wanted to shake off the surrealist label that was given to her, saying that she did not paint dreams but her own life. There she painted her self-portrait Abortion in Detroit, one of her most notable works. In the 1940s his work began to be valued, and he participated in different group exhibitions.
Margaret Keane. Known as the painter with giant eyes, Margaret Keane's artistic history is inextricably linked to that of her husband. In the early 1960s, Walter Keane was one of the most famous painters in the United States thanks to his portraits of women, children, and animals with large, sad eyes. But behind those canvases was not Walter, but Margaret, who painted tirelessly in her studio while her husband earned recognition and admiration. He said that his paintings were inspired by the poor children of post-war Berlin, and she only found out about the lie until she accompanied him to a club where some of his paintings were sold. But fear made him continue with the lie. Their paintings were increasingly popular and allowed them to buy a house in California. 10 years stressed their marriage when she decided to separate and flee to Hawaii. It was in the 70s, when her paintings were no longer in fashion, that Margaret Keane chose the moment to tell the truth, a movie Lice brought to the cinema by Tim Burton.
Yokoi Kusama. The Japanese artist began painting as a child, and the hallucinations she experienced, which were sometimes simply visual fields full of dots, would mark her work. Born in 1929, she moved to New York from Japan in the late 1950s to fulfill her desire to be an artist. Her first works, Infinity Net, consisted of large canvases on which she obsessively painted marks. Her paintings anticipated the minimalist movement, but her work turned towards the pop style. She soon became one of the most relevant figures of the New York avant-garde, sharing the spotlight with Andy Warhol. Her work expanded to the world of sculpture and installations, and touched on themes such as sexual anxiety, the body, and free love. During the 1970s, she returned to Japan and voluntarily entered a psychiatric hospital. In 1993, she represented Japan at the Venice Biennale, and important institutions have dedicated retrospective exhibitions to her in recent years.
Paula Rego. Considered one of the great figurative painters of the second half of the 20th century, the Portuguese Paula Rego has carved out a place for herself among the most outstanding painters of the last 2 centuries. Born in Lisbon in 1935, she emigrated to London and trained at the prestigious Slade School of Art. She enjoyed success with her first works, classified as neo-Dadaist, in the 60s and 70s. His creative universe is marked by images of his harsh childhood, and by controversial topics such as abortion or authoritarianism, reflected in works that walk between pop art and expressionism. The city of Cascais hosts the Casa das Historias Paula Rego, where some of her works are exhibited. It is also part of some of the most important collections in the world, such as those of the British Museum, the National Gallery in London, the Tate Modern and the Victoria and Albert Museum.